My whore woman cheated on me with thousands of men who got her the other day. I've always considered myself a pretty open-minded guy. In fact, I prided myself on being the kind of husband who could roll with the punches, take things in stride, and keep our marriage fun and exciting. My wife, Jessica, and I had been together for 10 years, and we had 4 incredible kids. 3 rowdy boys and a headstrong teenage daughter who ruled the roost like a tiny monarch. Life was chaotic, sure, but it was ours, and I thought we had it all figured out. Jessica was the kind of woman who lit up a room when she walked in. She was confident, witty, and had this mischievous streak that kept life interesting. One night, as we were unwinding with a glass of wine after getting the kids to bed, she casually dropped a bombshell on me. "What do you think about trying something new?" she asked, swirling her glass. I laughed. "New how? Yoga? Skydiving? We talking a new casserole recipe?" Her grin widened, and she leaned in closer. "No, I mean in the bedroom." My heart skipped a beat. Not because I was uncomfortable, but because I could already tell Jessica had put some serious thought into this. "Okay," I said cautiously. "I'm listening." She launched into this whole spiel about spicing things up, keeping the spark alive, blah, blah. The climax of her pitch? A threesome with another woman. I almost spit out my wine. "Seriously?" I asked, half laughing. "You're actually suggesting this?" She shrugged, like it was the most casual thing in the world. "Why not? It could be fun. No strings attached. Just something to try, you know?" I was floored, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't intrigued. The idea seemed wild, but also tempting. After some awkward conversations and a lot of thinking, I agreed. And honestly, it was fine. More than fine, actually. It brought us closer in a weird way, and I thought that would be the end of it. But then came part 2 of her grand plan. "You know," Jessica said one night a few months later, "what's fair is fair. Maybe we could, reverse the roles next time." I froze. "You mean bring in another guy?" Her face lit up like I'd just solved a puzzle she'd been struggling with for weeks. "Exactly. You've had your turn, so now it's mine." I'll admit, the idea didn't sit well with me at first. Call it jealousy, insecurity, whatever. You don't expect to have these conversations with the mother of your kids. But Jessica was persuasive, and at the end of the day, I wanted her to be happy. So, I agreed. It happened, and to my surprise, things seemed normal afterward. Life carried on. We had our moments, our highs and lows, but overall, I thought we were solid. Until everything came crashing down. I'll save the fireworks for the next part, but let's just say that trip to California with the kids? That was the beginning of the end. What I didn't know at the time was that Jessica wasn't sick like she claimed. Nope. While I was juggling Disney parks and diaper changes, she was planning her world record attempt. Yeah, a literal Guinness World Record for the most sexual partners in 12 hours. And the kicker? The whole thing was caught on camera, 55 cameras to be exact. But that's just the setup. You won't believe what came next. The trip to California with the kids was supposed to be our bonding time. Jessica had claimed she wasn't feeling well and needed to stay home. She'd been a little off for a few weeks, quieter, more distracted, but I chalked it up to stress. Between our 4 kids, her job, and managing the chaos of daily life, it made sense she'd need a break. What didn't make sense was how eager she was to stay behind. Usually, Jessica hated missing out on family trips. She was the planner, the one who made sure every detail was perfect. But this time, she waved us off with a smile and told me to enjoy the time with the kids. I didn't think much of it at first. The trip was exhausting but fun. Between the roller coasters, beach days, and trying to keep the boys from terrorizing their sister, I barely had a moment to breathe. But even in the middle of all the chaos, something felt off. Jessica wasn't calling or texting as much as usual. When she did, her responses felt rushed and vague. "Hey, how are you feeling?" I'd asked during one of our calls. "Better," she said quickly, her voice almost too cheerful. "Just resting. You know how it is." I didn't push. I trusted her. But everything changed the day we got back. We arrived home late. The kids passed out in the car. I carried them inside one by one, tucking them into bed. The house was quiet, too quiet. Jessica was nowhere to be found, and her car wasn't in the driveway. I checked my phone. No messages. That's when I noticed the envelope sitting on the kitchen counter. My name was scrawled across the front in Jessica's handwriting. My heart sank. I opened it, expecting maybe a sweet note about how much she missed us or an apology for not being there. Instead, it was a cryptic message. I've been working on something important. You'll probably see it online before I can explain. Please don't judge me until you hear my side of the story. What? My brain couldn't process it. What could she possibly be talking about? I was still standing there, rereading the note, when my phone buzzed. A notification from my friend Mike popped up in our group chat. Dude, WTF is this? Is this Jessica? Attached was a link to a trending video. My stomach flipped. I clicked the link, and there she was, my wife Jessica, in our living room, surrounded by people. The video's title burned into my brain. Woman attempts world record. Most sexual partners in 12 hours. I froze. My ears started ringing, my vision tunneling as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The video was a montage of clips, all taken from various angles. 55 cameras, all capturing my wife in our house, doing the unthinkable. I wanted to believe it was some kind of sick joke, but there was no denying it. That was Jessica. Her face, her voice, her laugh, and the comments, thousands of them, confirmed the worst. People were treating it like entertainment, sharing and tagging their friends. OMG, she's a legend. How do you even set this up? Is this guy married? Imagine being her husband. I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. My legs gave out, and I sat on the floor, trying to catch my breath. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the sheer scale of it. The public humiliation, the fact that she'd turned our home into the set of some disgusting spectacle. What hurt the most was the realization that she probably thought she'd get away with it. How else could she justify doing something so outrageous? The kids were still asleep upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just hit. I had to keep it together, for them if nothing else. But as I sat there, my mind raced with questions. How long had she been planning this? Did she even care about the consequences? Did she think I'd just never find out? And most importantly, what was I going to do now? Before I could start unraveling it all, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Jessica was home. I stood up, adrenaline coursing through me as I waited for her to walk through the door. The note, the video, all of it swirled in my head as I prepared for the confrontation of a lifetime. She walked in with that same cheerful smile, carrying a bag of groceries like nothing had happened. "Hey, you're back," she said, her tone light, almost excited. I stared at her, my heart pounding. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered. "What's wrong?" I held up my phone. The video paused on her face. "You tell me." Her eyes widened, and for the first time in years, she looked genuinely scared. "Where did you?" she started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw everything, Jessica," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Everything." And just like that, her carefully constructed world started to crumble. Jessica froze in the doorway, the bag of groceries slipping from her hand and tumbling to the floor. A carton of eggs broke on impact, spilling across the tiles, but she didn't even flinch. Her eyes were locked on my phone, the screen still showing a paused frame of the video. Her mouth opened and closed like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. For the first time since I'd known her, Jessica looked completely powerless. "Say something," I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. "Anything." She blinked rapidly, her hands trembling as she reached for the counter to steady herself. "It's not what it looks like," she stammered. I laughed bitterly, running a hand through my hair. "Not what it looks like? Are you kidding me? It's exactly what it looks like, Jessica. You turned our home into a circus." "I didn't mean for you to find out like this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, so you meant for me never to find out at all? That's so much better," I shot back. "What were you thinking?" "No, scratch that. Were you even thinking at all?" Her face flushed, and for a moment, it looked like she might cry. But then something in her snapped. Her expression hardened, and her voice turned defensive. "You don't understand, okay? This wasn't some random decision. It was important to me." "Important to you?" I repeated, dumbfounded. "What about me? What about our kids? Did you even stop to think about how this would affect any of us?" She threw her hands up in frustration. You're always so quick to judge. You don't know what it's like feeling stuck, invisible, like no one sees you anymore. I wanted to do something for me, something that made me feel alive. Alive, I echoed, my voice rising. You decided the best way to feel alive was to sleep with 1,000 people on camera? Are you hearing yourself right now? Jessica crossed her arms and looked away, her jaw clenched. You wouldn't get it. You never cared about how I felt. You were too busy being Dad of the Year on this perfect family trip while I was stuck here, drowning in the same boring routine day after day. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You're blaming me for this? You're seriously blaming me for your choices? Her eyes flicked back to mine, and for a moment, I saw something that looked like guilt. But just as quickly it was gone. I'm not saying it's all your fault, she said quietly. But you stopped paying attention to me a long time ago. I needed something more, something different, and I didn't think you'd ever understand. I stared at her, trying to process her words, but all I could feel was rage. You didn't think I'd understand? You didn't even give me the chance. You made a mockery of everything we built together, of our marriage, our family. And for what? 15 minutes of fame? Jessica bit her lip and glanced away, unable to meet my eyes. Do you even realize what you've done? I asked, my voice quieter now, but no less intense. Do you have any idea how public this is? People are already talking about it, Jessica. The kids are going to find out. Our kids. How am I supposed to protect them from this? She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with something that might have been regret. I didn't want to hurt anyone, she said softly. I thought this would be something private, something I could keep separate from us. Private? I barked out a humorless laugh. It's all over the internet, Jessica. There's nothing private about this. You didn't just cross a line. You obliterated it. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the tension in the room so thick it was suffocating. Finally, Jessica spoke, her voice trembling. What do you want me to do? She asked, her tone almost pleading. I looked at her, the woman I'd once loved so deeply, and felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. I don't even know where to start, I admitted. But this? Us? I don't know if we can come back from this. Jessica flinched like I'd slapped her, but she didn't argue. Instead, she sank into one of the kitchen chairs, burying her face in her hands. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't feel like we were on the same team. And as I stood there, watching her break down, I realized I didn't feel sorry for her. Not yet, anyway. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The silence between us in the kitchen was deafening, broken only by the sound of the refrigerator humming and the occasional drip of broken eggs hitting the floor. Jessica stayed hunched over, her face buried in her hands. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to ask her how she could be so reckless. But my words felt trapped behind a lump of disbelief and anger. I turned away from her, pacing the kitchen to collect my thoughts. The reality of the situation hit me harder with every step. This wasn't just some private affair, it was a spectacle. People would recognize her. Heck, people were already recognizing her. My phone buzzed again, and I knew without looking it was another friend or acquaintance asking the same thing. Is this for real? I had no idea what to tell them, because I barely knew what to tell myself. Jessica, I said finally, turning to face her. My voice was calm now, the kind of calm that comes when anger is so overwhelming you can't even express it anymore. How do you even pull this off? The cameras, the people. Did you plan this for weeks? Months? She looked up slowly, her face pale, her eyes rimmed red. It wasn't like that, she mumbled. Then what was it like? I snapped. She sighed, her voice trembling as she spoke. I didn't plan for it to be this big. I was just, looking for something different. A friend told me about this group, this challenge. It sounded wild and exciting, and I thought, why not? I didn't expect it to blow up like this. Blow up like this? I repeated, incredulous. Jessica, you turned our house into the set of a porn shoot. How could you not expect this to blow up? Her hands clenched into fists, and she finally snapped back, her voice rising. Do you think I wanted this to happen? Do you think I wanted to hurt you or the kids? I just wanted something for myself. Okay, for once in my life, I wanted to feel like I wasn't just a mom or a wife. I stared at her, my jaw tightening. You think this makes you more than a mom or a wife? You humiliated yourself? You humiliated us. Her defiance crumbled again, and she slumped in the chair, her energy drained. I didn't think it through, she admitted quietly. That's the understatement of the century, I muttered. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My head was pounding, and my heart felt like it had been torn in two. Finally, I turned and grabbed a trash bag, starting to clean up the broken eggs on the floor. The mundane task gave me something to focus on, a way to ground myself in the middle of this emotional storm. Jessica watched me silently for a while before speaking again. Do you want me to leave? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I stopped cleaning and looked at her. Her face was blank, her voice hollow. Part of me wanted to scream yes. But the other part of me, the part that had loved her for a decade, built a family with her, hesitated. I don't know, I said finally, my voice heavy. I honestly don't know what I want right now. But what I do know is that this can't just be swept under the rug. You've made a mess of everything, and I have to think about what's best for the kids. She nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. I understand. Did she? I wasn't sure. But at that moment, I didn't have the energy to care. I need some air, I said, grabbing my keys. I'll be back later. Jessica didn't respond, and I didn't look back as I walked out the door. As I sat in my car, parked in a random lot a few miles from home, I scrolled through my phone, half hoping the whole thing would vanish. But there it was, staring back at me. The video, the headlines, the comments. I found myself clicking through articles and posts, each one worse than the last. People were analyzing every second of the footage, speculating about her motives, her background, and, of course, her family. Who's her husband? Does he know? One comment read, Yeah, I knew. I knew, and I had no idea what to do about it. I wanted to shut it all off, to block it out and pretend it wasn't real. But I couldn't, because no matter how much I wanted to escape, this was my reality now. Jessica's choices weren't just affecting her. They were affecting all of us. My phone buzzed again. This time it was my daughter, Megan. Dad, when are you coming home? Everything okay? I stared at the message, my chest tightening. Megan was sharp, way too perceptive for her age. She'd pick up on the tension between Jessica and me in no time if she hadn't already. And when the kids inevitably found out about the video, how was I supposed to explain this? I took a deep breath and typed back, Everything's fine. I'll be home soon. But I knew nothing was fine, and deep down I wasn't sure if it ever would be again. When I finally walked back through the door, Jessica was still sitting in the kitchen, staring blankly at her phone. She looked up as I entered, her face a mix of hope and dread. Did you figure out what you want to do? She asked cautiously. No, I admitted, my voice flat. But we need to set some ground rules. First, we tell the kids nothing until I figure out how to handle this. Second, you're going to do whatever it takes to fix this mess, whether that means issuing a statement, pulling the video offline, whatever. Do you understand? She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears again. I'll do whatever you need me to do. Her words sounded sincere, but I wasn't ready to believe them yet. The trust between us was gone, and it would take more than promises to rebuild it, if it could be rebuilt at all. This wasn't the end of the conversation. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. It was just the beginning of the fallout, and I had no idea how far the debris would spread. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd barely slept. Jessica was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a mug of coffee untouched beside her. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot. For a second, she almost looked like the woman I used to know before all of this. I leaned against the doorway, watching her. What are you doing? Trying to get it taken down? She said without looking up. The video, the articles, everything. Her voice was shaky but determined. I walked over and glanced at the screen. She had tabs open to a dozen different platforms and websites, all hosting or sharing clips from the video. Each time she got one removed, another two would pop up. Any luck? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shook her head. It's everywhere. I can't keep up. I felt a surge of frustration. What did you think was going to happen, Jessica? That you could do something like this and just keep it private? She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she sighed. rubbing her temples. I didn't think it would spiral like this. It was supposed to be a controlled thing, part of a community. I stared at her in disbelief. A community? What kind of community encourages this? Did they also promise to erase the internet afterward? Jessica bit her lip and kept typing, ignoring my sarcasm. I wanted to keep pressing her, to demand answers, but I forced myself to take a step back. Yelling wasn't going to fix anything. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. Have you thought about what we're going to tell the kids? Her hands froze on the keyboard, and she looked up at me, panic flashing across her face. Do we have to tell them? I mean, maybe they won't find out. I shook my head. Jessica, this thing has gone viral. It's only a matter of time before someone at Megan's school sees it. Or worse, shows it to her. She buried her face in her hands, groaning. I can't believe I let it get this far. Well, it has, I said bluntly. And now we have to deal with it. By mid-afternoon, the storm had only grown. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends, co-workers, and even acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years. Everyone wanted to know if the rumors were true, if that really was Jessica in the video. I ignored most of the messages, but one caught my attention. It was from Megan's soccer coach, Mrs. Taylor. Hey, just wanted to let you know Megan was unusually quiet at practice today. If there's anything going on at home, let me know if I can help. My stomach sank. Megan didn't know yet. At least I didn't think she did. But she was clearly picking up on the tension. The kids weren't stupid. Jessica, I said, my tone serious. We need to talk about this now. The kids are already sensing something's wrong. She looked up from her laptop, her face drawn. What do you want me to say, Luke? That I'm sorry? That I made a mistake? I know I did. But how do you explain this to your kids? How do you even start that conversation? I don't know, I admitted. But we don't have the luxury of waiting until we figure it out. If we don't control the narrative, someone else will. And then it's out of our hands. Jessica nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. You're right. But I can't do it. I can't face them. My jaw clenched, anger bubbling up again. You don't get to opt out of this, Jessica. You made this mess, and now we both have to deal with it. She didn't respond, just wiped her eyes and stared down at her coffee mug. That evening, after the kids had finished dinner and were winding down in the living room, I called them into the kitchen. Jessica sat at the table, silent and fidgeting with her hands. What's going on, Dad? Megan asked, glancing between us. The boys stood beside her, their carefree energy suddenly subdued by the tension in the room. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. Your mom and I need to talk to you about something important. I began, my voice steady but strained. Jessica looked up, her eyes meeting mine. I could see the fear in her expression, the fear of what was about to happen, of what this would do to her relationship with the kids. We've been dealing with some difficult things, I continued, choosing my words carefully. And it's going to take us some time to work through them. But I want you all to know that no matter what, we love you. That hasn't changed, and it never will. Megan frowned, her sharp teenage instincts kicking in. Is this about why you two have been acting weird lately? Jessica nodded, her voice trembling as she finally spoke. Yes, sweetie. It is. I made a mistake, a big one. And it's something I'm going to have to work hard to make right. What kind of mistake? Megan pressed, her tone cautious but curious. Jessica glanced at me, and I saw the plea in her eyes. Please, help me explain this. I stepped in, trying to shield the kids from the full weight of the truth. It's something that's mostly between your mom and me, I said carefully. But it's also something that's out there, and people might talk about it. If anyone says anything to you, or if you ever feel confused or upset, you come to us, okay? You talk to us first. The kids nodded slowly, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. Are you two getting divorced? Megan asked, her voice small. Jessica's breath hitched, and I saw fresh tears in her eyes. We don't know yet, she admitted softly. But we're going to do everything we can to figure things out. The boys didn't say much, but their silence spoke volumes. They didn't fully understand what was going on, but they knew enough to sense that something big was shifting in their world. As they shuffled back to the living room, I felt an ache in my chest. This was just the beginning of the fallout, and the road ahead was going to be long and painful. Jessica stayed at the table, her head in her hands, as I cleaned up the kitchen. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I could look at her without feeling the sting of betrayal. But this wasn't just about us anymore. It was about the kids. And somehow, I had to find a way to protect them from the storm Jessica had unleashed. The days that followed were a blur of tension, whispers, and damage control. Jessica spent hours glued to her laptop, desperately trying to clean up the mess online. Every time she managed to get a clip or article taken down, two more seemed to pop up in its place. It was like trying to put out a wildfire with a garden hose. Meanwhile, the calls and messages kept pouring in. Friends, family, even co-workers reached out, either to express their shock or to subtly fish for information. I stopped answering altogether, unable to handle the flood of questions and unsolicited advice. The worst part was the growing number of strangers weighing in. Jessica's video had turned her into an overnight internet sensation, and not in a good way. She wasn't just that woman from the video anymore. She was a meme, a punchline. World record wife, one comment read. Bet her husband's a saint or an idiot, another added. I couldn't stop myself from reading them, even though every word felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Jessica seemed to be taking it even harder. She rarely left the house, and when she did, she wore oversized sunglasses and a hat, as if that would somehow shield her from recognition. One morning, I caught her staring at herself in the mirror, her eyes puffy and red. "They hate me," she said quietly, not looking away from her reflection. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to console her, to tell her it would blow over eventually. But another part of me, the part that was still seething with anger and betrayal, wanted her to face the consequences of her choices. "What did you expect?" I said, my tone harsher than I intended. "You did something outrageous and put it on the internet. People are going to talk." She winced, her shoulders sagging. "I didn't think it through." "I didn't think." "Yeah, you didn't," I interrupted, unable to hold back. "And now we're all paying for it." Jessica turned away from the mirror, her face crumpling. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't know how to fix this." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "You can't fix it, Jess. Not completely. But you need to own it. Stop hiding, stop pretending this will just go away. Face it." She nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Jessica wasn't the type to confront her problems head-on. She avoided them, smoothed over the cracks, and hoped no one would notice. But this time, there was no hiding from the fallout. Later that day, I got a call from my sister, Erica. I hadn't told her the full story yet, but it was clear she knew something was up. "Luke," she said, her tone careful, "I'm worried about you. I saw the news." I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Yeah, it's been a nightmare." "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked gently. "Because I don't even know how to explain it," I admitted. "How do you tell people that your wife turned your house into a world record stunt without sounding like your life is a bad reality show?" Erica paused. "You don't have to explain it, Luke. But you can't go through this alone. If you need help with the kids, with anything, you know I'm here, right?" I felt a lump rise in my throat. Erica and I weren't exactly close, but hearing her offer support in the middle of this mess meant more than I could put into words. "Thanks," I said, my voice thick. "I might take you up on that." That night, after the kids were in bed, Jessica and I sat down for another one of our increasingly tense talks. The air between us felt heavy, loaded with all the unspoken things we were too afraid, or too angry, to say. "We need a plan," I said, breaking the silence. "This isn't just going to blow over. People aren't going to forget overnight." Jessica nodded, her hands twisting in her lap. "I've been thinking about maybe doing an interview, explaining myself." I blinked at her, caught off guard. "An interview? You mean like with the media?" She nodded again, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't know what else to do. If I don't say something, people are just going to keep making up their own stories. Maybe if I tell the truth, it'll take some of the heat off us, off the kids." I wasn't sure how to feel about the idea. On one hand, it seemed risky, opening herself up to even more scrutiny. But on the other hand, she wasn't wrong. The longer we stayed silent, the more people would speculate, and the more damage it could do. "It's your call," I said finally. "But if you're going to do this, you need to be honest." No excuses, no trying to spin it. Just own up to it. Jessica looked at me, her eyes glistening with tears. Do you think it'll help? I don't know, I admitted. But it can't make things worse. She nodded, and for the first time in days, I saw a flicker of determination in her expression. The next morning, Jessica made the call. A local news outlet agreed to do an interview, promising a compassionate and respectful approach to the story. I wasn't sure I trusted them, but Jessica seemed resolute. As the interview date approached, the tension in the house grew. Jessica spent hours preparing, writing, and rewriting what she wanted to say. I tried to focus on the kids, shielding them from the chaos as much as I could. But deep down, I knew this interview would be a turning point, for better or worse. When the day finally arrived, I watched from the sidelines as Jessica sat under the bright studio lights, her face pale but composed. The interviewer began with a soft, understanding tone, but the questions quickly became sharper. "Why did you do it?" they asked. "What made you think this was a good idea?" Jessica hesitated, her eyes darting toward the camera. I held my breath, waiting for her response. "I thought I was doing something for myself," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But I didn't think about how it would affect my family. I let them down, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to erase the damage. But it was a start, and as I watched her stumble through her answers, I realized that while I wasn't ready to forgive her, I wasn't ready to give up completely either. Not yet. The interview aired that evening, and as expected, it caused a ripple through our already fragile lives. Jessica sat beside me on the couch, watching herself on the screen, her face pale and drawn. She flinched at certain parts, like hearing her own voice say the words made them feel more real. The kids were upstairs, thankfully spared from the fallout for now, but I knew the questions would come soon. Megan had already started giving us suspicious looks, and it was only a matter of time before the boys picked up on the tension in the house. As the credits rolled, Jessica turned to me, her eyes searching mine. "Was that okay?" I took a deep breath, unsure how to respond. The interview had been raw, emotional, and at times painfully awkward. She had apologized repeatedly, admitted her mistakes, and tried to explain the unexplainable. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't a disaster either. "It's a start," I said finally. Jessica nodded, her shoulders slumping in relief. "I just hope people see that I'm trying to make things right." I didn't have the heart to tell her that the public wasn't likely to be forgiving. The internet doesn't forget, and it certainly doesn't forgive. The next day, the fallout from the interview hit in full force. Social media was ablaze with comments, some supportive but most scathing. "She's just trying to save face. Too little too late. Her poor husband and kids. I can't imagine the shame they're feeling." I tried to ignore it, but the words were like a drumbeat in the back of my mind, growing louder with every notification. Jessica, on the other hand, buried herself in damage control. She responded to messages, blocked trolls, and even tried to engage with some of the kinder comments. But I could see the strain wearing on her. By lunchtime, she was pale and shaking, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone. "Jessica," I said gently, sitting down across from her, "you need to step away from this. It's not healthy." She shook her head, her voice frantic. "I can't. If I stop, it'll just get worse. I have to show people that I'm not some monster." "You can't control what people think," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "And honestly, the more you try, the worse it's going to get. Let it breathe. Let people move on." She stared at me for a long moment before finally setting her phone down. "I don't know how to move on from this, Luke. I don't even know who I am anymore." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For all my anger and resentment, it was hard not to feel a pang of sympathy. Jessica had made a monumental mistake, but she was still the mother of my kids, the woman I'd shared a life with for over a decade. "You need to figure that out," I said softly. "Not for them, not for the internet, for you. Because right now, you're letting this define you." Later that evening, as I was tucking the kids into bed, Megan stopped me in the hallway. "Dad," she said hesitantly, her arms crossed over her chest. "Yes, sweetheart?" I asked, bracing myself for whatever was coming. She bit her lip, her eyes darting toward her brother's room before meeting mine. Is Mom okay? She's been acting weird lately. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. She's going through a tough time right now. But we're working on it. Megan frowned, her gaze piercing. Does it have to do with the video? My stomach dropped. What video? I asked carefully, trying to gauge how much she knew. She shrugged, her expression guarded. Some kids at school were talking about it. I didn't watch it, but is it bad? I knelt down to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. Megan, listen to me. There's a lot of stuff being said right now, and not all of it is true. If you hear something that upsets you, I want you to come to me, okay? No matter what. She nodded slowly, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Okay, Dad. As she walked back to her room, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. The last thing I wanted was for my kids to be dragged into this mess, but it was already happening. That night, as Jessica and I sat in the quiet living room, I finally voiced the question that had been eating away at me. Why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why did you do it? She looked up from her lap, her eyes glassy with tears. I don't know, she admitted. I was bored. I felt invisible. I thought, maybe if I did something crazy, something big, I'd feel alive again. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping me. Alive? You've burned our life to the ground, Jess. How does that make you feel alive? She flinched, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't thinking about you, or the kids, or anyone but myself. And now, I don't know how to fix it. The anger in me simmered, but I couldn't ignore the raw vulnerability in her voice. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw a glimmer of the woman I'd fallen in love with. The one who had always been bold, impulsive, and fearless, but never cruel. You can't fix it overnight, I said finally. But if you want any chance of repairing this, of repairing us, you need to stop running from it. Own it, face it, and start putting the pieces back together. Jessica nodded, wiping her eyes. I will, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. I'll do whatever it takes. I wanted to believe her. But trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt with words. It would take time, effort, and a lot of soul-searching for both of us. And as I sat there, staring at the shattered woman across from me, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever truly recover from this, or if the cracks in our foundation were too deep to mend. The next morning started like any other. Breakfast, school lunches, and the usual chaos of getting the kids out the door. But the atmosphere in the house felt heavy, like we were all walking on eggshells. Jessica tried to keep a brave face, offering the kids forced smiles and overly cheery goodbyes. Megan barely looked at her. After the kids left, the silence was suffocating. Jessica sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone, while I stood at the counter nursing my coffee. I think Megan knows more than she's letting on, I said finally, breaking the quiet. Jessica's head shot up, her face pale. What do you mean? She overheard something at school. Kids were talking about the video. Her eyes widened, and she put her phone down. Oh my God! What did she say? She didn't see it, I said quickly. But she's suspicious. She asked if it was bad. Jessica groaned, burying her face in her hands. I knew this would happen. I knew it. I should have said something to her before. It wouldn't have made a difference, I interrupted. The second this went public, it was out of our control. The only thing we can do now is manage the fallout. Jessica looked up at me, her expression a mix of guilt and desperation. What do we tell her? What do we tell all of them? I set my coffee down and leaned against the counter, crossing my arms. We tell them the truth, but not the whole truth. They don't need to know every detail. We keep it simple. You made a mistake, it's out there, and we're working on fixing it. She nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. And if they ask for more? Then we cross that bridge when we get to it, I said. Later that afternoon, I got a call from the school. My heart sank when I saw the number on my screen, and I braced myself for bad news as I answered. Mr. Carter, this is Mrs. Taylor from Megan's school, the voice on the other end said. I wanted to let you know there was an incident today involving Megan. What kind of incident? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. She got into an argument with some other students during lunch. Apparently, they were saying some inappropriate things about your family. Megan defended you, but it escalated, and we had to step in. I clenched my jaw, my free hand curling into a fist. Is she okay? She's shaken up, but physically she's fine, Mrs. Taylor assured me. We've spoken to the other students involved, and we'll be addressing it with their parents. But I thought you should know. Thank you for calling, I said tightly. I'll talk to her when she gets home. As I hung up, I felt a wave of anger and helplessness wash over me. This was exactly what I'd feared, the kids getting dragged into this mess. When Megan got home, she was unusually quiet, heading straight to her room without so much as a hello. I knocked on her door a few minutes later, and she let me in reluctantly. She was sitting on her bed, her arms wrapped around her knees. I don't want to talk about it, she said before I could say anything. I know you don't, I said gently, sitting down beside her. But we need to. Mrs. Taylor called me. Megan groaned, burying her face in her arms. I hate them. They were saying all this stuff about Mom like they knew everything. But they don't know anything. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. What did they say? She hesitated, then looked up at me, her eyes red. They said Mom was in some gross video and that everyone at school's talking about it. They were laughing, Dad. Laughing at her. At us. Hearing the hurt in her voice felt like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell her it would all blow over, that things would be okay. But I didn't want to lie to her either. Megan, I said carefully, there are a lot of people saying things right now, and not all of it is true. What I need you to remember is that your mom loves you, no matter what. And so do I. Nothing anyone says changes that. She nodded, but I could tell my words only did so much. Why did she do it, Dad? I froze, unsure how to answer. How do you explain something so complicated, so hurtful, to a 14-year-old? She made a mistake, I said finally. A big one. But mistakes don't define who we are. It's what we do after them that matters. Megan frowned, clearly unsatisfied with my answer. But she didn't push. Instead, she leaned her head against my shoulder, and we sat there in silence. When I told Jessica about the incident later, she broke down completely. This is my fault, she sobbed, pacing the living room. I've ruined everything. Megan, the boys, you. I've ruined all of you. I stood there, my own frustration bubbling beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. What's done is done, Jessica. Beating yourself up about it isn't going to help anyone. She stopped pacing and looked at me, her eyes wide with desperation. Then what do I do, Luke? Tell me what to do, and I'll do it. Just tell me how to fix this. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. You can't fix it overnight, but you can start by being there for the kids. Be honest with them, within reason. Show them that you're taking responsibility and that you're willing to change. She nodded, her tears spilling over again. I'll try. I'll do whatever it takes. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But as I watched her crumble under the weight of her choices, I couldn't help but wonder if this was something even time couldn't heal. For now, all I could do was focus on the kids. They needed stability, reassurance, and a dad who wouldn't let this mess define their lives. Jessica and I had a long road ahead of us, but the kids came first. They always would. And if that meant keeping my anger in check and holding this crumbling family together a little while longer, so be it. The days following Megan's confrontation at school were tense, to say the least. Jessica spent most of her time trying to repair her image online, alternating between frantic bursts of activity and bouts of silence that filled the house with an unbearable weight. I focused on the kids, making sure they felt as normal as possible, even though nothing about our lives was normal anymore. The interview had done little to stop the avalanche of public scrutiny. If anything, it seemed to fan the flames. People dissected every word Jessica had said, twisting her apologies and explanations into memes and hashtags. Hashtag World Record Wife was trending. Look at this, Jessica said one evening, holding up her phone. Her voice was flat, her eyes hollow. They're calling me a joke. A punchline. I didn't respond. I didn't know how to. The truth was I was barely holding it together myself. Every time I stepped out of the house, I felt the weight of invisible eyes on me, the whispers and judgment following me everywhere. Coworkers gave me awkward smiles or avoided me altogether. Friends sent vague texts offering support without ever explicitly mentioning why. I felt trapped, boxed in by Jessica's decisions, and there was no way out. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon. Megan had been invited to a friend's birthday party, and I could tell she was hesitant about going. "What if people say stuff?" she asked, her voice uncertain as she fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. "They won't," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. "And if they do, you tell them it's none of their business. You've done nothing wrong." Megan nodded reluctantly and let me drop her off. I stayed in the car for a few minutes, watching as she joined the group of kids. She smiled nervously, her shoulders tense, but eventually, she seemed to relax. For a moment, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe things were starting to settle. That hope shattered 2 hours later when I got a frantic call from the friend's mom. "Megan's upset," she said, her voice hurried. "Some of the kids were saying things about Jessica. I think you should come get her." I didn't waste any time. When I arrived, Megan was sitting on the front steps, her face red and blotchy from crying. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling in front of her. She sniffled, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "They were showing the video, Dad. On their phones. Laughing." My blood ran cold. "Who? Who was doing it?" "It doesn't matter," she said quietly. "I just want to go home." That night, after putting Megan to bed, I finally snapped. Jessica and I had barely spoken all day, and the tension in the house had reached a boiling point. "We need to talk," I said, finding her in the living room. Jessica looked up from her laptop, her expression weary. "What now?" "Megan's friends were showing the video today," I said bluntly. Her face fell, and she closed the laptop. "Oh my God. Is she okay?" "She's not okay, Jessica," I snapped. "None of us are okay. Do you realize what this is doing to the kids? To me? We can't go a single day without this thing blowing up in our faces." Jessica flinched, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Luke. I've told you that 100 times. And 100 times isn't enough," I shot back. "Because it keeps happening. Every day it's something new. A new headline, a new comment, a new way for this to hurt us. When does it stop, Jessica? When do you take responsibility and actually fix this?" She stood up, her hands trembling. "What do you want me to do?" "I've apologized. I've explained myself. I'll try to clean up the mess. What else can I do?" I shook my head, my frustration boiling over. "I don't know, but I can't keep living like this. I can't keep picking up the pieces while you sit here feeling sorry for yourself." Jessica's face crumpled, and she sank back into the couch. "I don't know how to fix it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't even know where to start." I took a deep breath, trying to rein in my anger. "You start by putting the kids first. By putting this family first. Forget about the internet. Forget about your image. Focus on us for once." Jessica nodded slowly, her tears streaming down her face. "You're right. I've been selfish. I don't know how to make it right. Figure it out," I said, my tone softer now but still firm. "Because we can't keep going like this." Later that night, as I lay awake in bed, I thought about what Megan had said earlier. About the kids laughing, showing the video on their phones. I realized then that this wasn't going to blow over. Not for a long time. And maybe not ever. The damage was done, and no amount of apologies or interviews could undo it. Jessica's choices had changed everything. Our marriage, our family, our future. And as much as I wanted to believe we could weather this storm, part of me wondered if it was already too late. The days blurred together into a routine of damage control, half-hearted apologies, and the constant shadow of Jessica's choices hanging over our heads. Megan was still distant, the boys were confused, and Jessica? She seemed to alternate between trying to fix things and retreating into herself. I was doing my best to hold it together, but the cracks were widening. Every interaction between Jessica and me felt loaded, like a powder keg ready to explode. One evening, after the kids were in bed, I found her sitting in the backyard, staring at the stars. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her expression unreadable. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, my voice quiet. She nodded without looking at me, and I sat down on the patio chair beside her. For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sounds were the distant hum of cars and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this," Jessica said suddenly, her voice trembling. I turned to look at her, surprised. What do you mean? This, she said, gesturing vaguely at the house. Fixing things. Trying to move forward. Facing everyone. I feel like every step I take is just wrong. Like I'm making things worse no matter what I do. You made things worse the moment you decided to do this, I said, sharper than I intended. She flinched, her face crumpling. I know that, Luke. But I'm trying. Doesn't that count for something? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. It does. But trying doesn't erase what you did, Jess. You didn't just hurt me. You hurt the kids. You put our entire lives on display for the world to pick apart. Her eyes glistened with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out, but instead, she nodded. You're right. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I can't give up, not on the kids, not on us. I just don't know where to start. I leaned back in my chair, staring up at the sky. It's not about some grand gesture. It's about showing up every day and putting in the work. That's the only way forward, if there even is a way forward. Jessica wiped her eyes and nodded again. I'll keep showing up, she whispered. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The next day, things took another turn. Jessica's interview, while meant to show her taking accountability, had only fueled the internet frenzy. People dissected her every word, twisting them into memes and viral tweets. I could tell it was breaking her, but there wasn't much I could do. Then the worst thing happened. Someone leaked our home address. I found out when I opened the door to a delivery I hadn't ordered. A pizza with the word "World Record Loser" scribbled on the box. At first, I thought it was just a prank, but the deliveries didn't stop. Flowers, balloons, even a box of adult toys. All sent anonymously, all referencing Jessica's stunt. When I told her, she broke down completely. They're never going to let this go, she sobbed, her hands shaking as she paced the living room. No matter what I do, no matter how much I apologize, they'll keep coming after me. Then maybe it's time to disappear for a while, I said, my tone firm. Jessica stopped pacing, staring at me in shock. What do you mean? I mean, you need to get away from the spotlight, I said. Take the kids and go somewhere quiet. Somewhere you can focus on them and figure out how to rebuild. And you? She asked, her voice small. I don't know yet, I admitted. But what we're doing right now, it's not working. For you, for me, or for the kids. Jessica's face crumpled again, but she nodded. If that's what you think is best. Over the next few days, we made arrangements for Jessica and the kids to stay with her sister in a small town a few hours away. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a way to buy some breathing room. The night before they left, I sat with Megan in her room, helping her pack. Are you coming with us? She asked, her voice hesitant. Not right now, I said gently. But I'll visit soon, I promise. Are you and Mom going to get a divorce? She asked, her eyes filled with worry. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I don't know, I said honestly. But no matter what happens, we're still a family. That won't change. Megan nodded, but the sadness in her eyes lingered. The morning they left, the house felt emptier than I expected. Watching them drive away, I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Relief that the kids were getting away from the chaos. Guilt that I wasn't going with them. Jessica had made a mess of our lives, but I couldn't ignore the fact that I'd been complicit in letting things fall apart. The cracks in our marriage hadn't started with her world record stunt. They'd been there for years, hidden beneath the surface. Now, with the house quiet and the weight of everything pressing down on me, I couldn't help but wonder if we'd ever be able to put the pieces back together, or if it was already too late. The house felt alien without Jessica and the kids. For years, the constant noise, the laughter, the arguments, the chaotic energy had been the backdrop of my life. Now, silence filled every room, amplifying the emptiness I felt inside. I wandered through the house, picking up stray toys and laundry they'd left behind. The boys' action figures were still scattered across the living room floor, a forgotten remnant of our old routine. Megan's favorite hoodie hung over the back of a chair. It felt like they were still here, but the stillness reminded me they weren't. I didn't know what to do with myself. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. By midday, I couldn't stand being in the house anymore. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly, ending up at a coffee shop across town. It wasn't one I usually went to, which was intentional. The last thing I needed was to run into someone who recognized me, or worse, wanted to talk about Jessica. I ordered a coffee and found a corner table, scrolling through my phone to distract myself. But as much as I wanted to avoid the internet, my curiosity got the better of me. I searched Jessica's name. The headlines were still there, as relentless as ever. World record scandal. Husband speaks out. Internet divided over Jessica Carter's apology. From family life to viral fame. A breakdown of the most shocking internet story of the year. It was surreal, seeing our private lives dissected by strangers like we were characters in a TV show. They speculated about my reaction, the kids' feelings, even the state of our finances. Some comments were cruel, others weirdly sympathetic, but all of them felt invasive. I scrolled until I couldn't take it anymore, shoving my phone into my pocket. "Hey," a voice said, startling me. I looked up to see a woman standing by my table, her face vaguely familiar. It took me a second to place her. Emma, a former coworker I hadn't seen in years. "Emma," I said, forcing a smile. "Wow, it's been a while." She smiled back, though there was a cautiousness in her expression. "Yeah, it has. Mind if I sit?" I hesitated but nodded. She pulled out a chair and sat down, setting her cup on the table. "I wasn't sure it was you," she admitted, glancing at me. "You look different." I chuckled dryly. "Life will do that to you." She tilted her head, studying me. I saw the news. There it was. I should have expected it, but hearing her say it still sent a jolt through me. "Yeah," I said, my tone flat. "Everyone has." Emma hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "I'm sorry. That's got to be rough." I nodded, not trusting myself to say more. "You holding up okay?" she asked, her voice soft. It was such a simple question, but it hit me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to give a generic answer, but instead, what came out was the truth. "Not really," I admitted, my voice cracking. "It's a mess, Emma. Everything's a mess." She gave me a sympathetic look, her eyes kind. "I can't imagine what you're going through. But for what it's worth, I think you're handling it better than most people would." I laughed bitterly. "That's a low bar." She smiled gently. "Maybe, but still you're here. You're showing up. That counts for something." Her words stuck with me long after we said goodbye. When I got back home, the silence felt even heavier. I sat in the kitchen, staring at the table where we'd shared so many meals as a family. I thought about Jessica, the kids, the life we'd built together, and the life we'd destroyed. I pulled out my phone and stared at Jessica's number. We hadn't spoken much since she left with the kids. Part of me wanted to check in, to ask how they were doing, but another part of me, the part still angry and hurt, didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing I cared. After a long moment, I typed out a message. "How are the kids?" Her reply came faster than I expected. "They're okay. Megan's still upset, but the boys seem happy to be with their cousins." "How are you?" I hesitated, then typed, "Fine." Her next message was longer. "I miss you. I know I have no right to say that, but I do. I miss us. I miss home." I stared at the message, my chest tightening. For all her flaws, for all the pain she'd caused, there was still a part of me that missed her too. But missing someone doesn't erase the damage they've done. I didn't reply. That night, I lay awake in the empty bed, my thoughts spiraling. Jessica's words echoed in my head, blending with the noise of everything else. Megan's pain, the boys' confusion, the relentless storm of public scrutiny. How had we ended up here? I wanted to believe there was a way forward, a way to rebuild what we'd lost. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered if some things were beyond repair. And as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the beginning of the end. Not just for Jessica and me, but for the life we'd built together. The days passed slowly, each one a repeat of the last. Wake up, work, eat, sleep. We'll try to sleep. The emptiness in the house was almost unbearable, but the quiet gave me too much time to think. Memories of the past 10 years played in my mind like an old home movie, flipping between the good moments, family trips, laughter, stolen kisses, and the bad ones, like the arguments we'd swept under the rug and the distance that had crept in between Jessica and me long before her betrayal. One night, unable to sit in silence any longer, I grabbed the box of old family photo albums from the attic. I hadn't looked through them in years, but something about seeing our life in snapshots felt less overwhelming than confronting it in my head. The first album was from our early years. There we were, young and carefree, grinning like idiots on our honeymoon in Hawaii. Then came pictures of Jessica pregnant with Megan, both of us glowing with excitement and naivety about what parenthood would bring. As I flipped through the pages, I found myself smiling at the memories. Megan's first steps, the boys covered head to toe in paint after one of Jessica's crafting adventures, a blurry selfie of the two of us laughing at some joke I couldn't remember anymore. But as the years went on, the photos became less frequent, the smiles less natural. There were more pictures of the kids and fewer of Jessica and me together. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped prioritizing each other. I closed the album, my chest tight. We hadn't just fallen apart in one catastrophic moment. It had been a slow unraveling, years in the making. The next morning, I called Jessica. She answered on the second ring, her voice hesitant. "Luke, hey," I said, clearing my throat. "How are things?" "They're okay," she said cautiously. "The kids are settling in. Megan's still distant, but I'm trying to give her space." "Good," I said, pausing before adding, "I've been thinking a lot. About us." There was a long silence on the other end before she said, And I don't know where we go from here," I admitted. "But I think we need to figure that out before we drag this out any longer, for the kids' sake, if nothing else." "I agree," she said quietly. "What do you want to do?" "I think we need to talk," I said. "Face to face. Not just about what happened, but about everything, where we went wrong, how we got here, if there's even anything left to salvage." Jessica let out a shaky breath. "I want to fix this, Luke. I really do. But I know I can't do it alone. If you're willing to talk, I'll do whatever it takes." "Then let's talk," I said. "But it's not going to be easy, Jess. If we do this, it's going to be messy. Honest." "I'm ready," she said, though her voice trembled. A few days later, Jessica came back to the house for our conversation. She left the kids with her sister, saying it was better if we could focus without distractions. When she walked through the door, it was like seeing her for the first time all over again. She looked exhausted but determined, her shoulders squared as if she was bracing herself for a fight. We sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where we'd had so many arguments and so many moments of connection. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I don't even know where to start," Jessica said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Start with the truth," I said. "Why? Why did you do it?" She flinched but nodded. "I told you before, but I'll say it again. I felt invisible, Luke. For years, it felt like I was just a mom, just a wife. I didn't feel like me anymore. And instead of talking to you about it, I did something selfish and stupid. I thought this stunt would make me feel alive, important, seen. But all it did was hurt the people I care about most." I listened, my jaw tightening as her words sank in. "Do you realize how much damage you've done?" I asked, my voice hard. "Not just to me, but to the kids. Megan is falling apart because of this. The boys are confused. And me? I don't even know if I can look at you without seeing what you've done." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't try to defend herself. "I know," she said softly, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I'm trying to change. I've been talking to a therapist, trying to figure out why I let it get to this point. I don't want to be this person anymore, Luke. I want to be better, for me, for the kids, and if there's even a sliver of hope for us, for you too." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For all the pain she'd caused, it was clear she was trying to take responsibility, to face her mistakes head on. "I don't know if we can fix this," I said honestly. "But if we're going to try, it's going to take a lot of work. And not just from you, from both of us." Jessica nodded, her expression earnest. "I'm ready for that. Whatever it takes, Luke. I'll do it." I wanted to believe her. But trust wasn't something you could rebuild overnight. "We'll start with counseling," I said. "Together. And we'll be honest with each other. Completely honest. No more hiding, no more running away from the hard stuff." Jessica's lip trembled, and she nodded again. "Okay," she whispered. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a promise of a happy ending. But it was a step, a small, tentative step towards something that might be worth saving. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Not certainty, not forgiveness, but hope. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to keep going. Counseling. It was a word that carried as much fear as it did promise. I hadn't stepped into a therapist's office since my parents divorced when I was 13, and the thought of sitting across from a stranger and airing the raw, ugly truths of my marriage made my stomach churn. But Jessica and I both knew it was necessary. If there was any hope of rebuilding, this was where we had to start. We scheduled our first session for a Thursday afternoon. Jessica insisted on coming to pick me up so we could drive there together. If we're doing this, we're doing it as a team, she'd said. When she pulled into the driveway that afternoon, I noticed she looked different. Not physically. She was still the same Jessica I'd known for years. But there was a quiet resolve in her expression, a determination that hadn't been there before. "You ready?" she asked as I slid into the passenger seat. "Not really," I admitted. She smiled faintly. "Me neither." The drive was silent except for the low hum of the radio. Neither of us seemed to know what to say, and honestly, I wasn't sure there was anything to say. The therapist's office was warm and inviting, with overstuffed chairs and calming artwork on the walls. It felt almost too cheerful for the weight of what we were carrying. Dr. Lacey, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a soothing voice, greeted us and invited us to sit. She didn't waste any time. "So," she began, looking between us, "tell me what brought you here." I glanced at Jessica, who hesitated before speaking. "I made a mistake," she said softly. "A huge mistake. And now we're trying to figure out if there's any way to move forward." Dr. Lacey nodded, her expression neutral. "Luke, do you agree with that assessment?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Yeah," I said. "But it's not just about the mistake. This didn't come out of nowhere. There's been a lot building up to this, things we ignored, things we didn't talk about. And now it's all blown up in our faces." Jessica looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt, but also something else. Understanding. Dr. Lacey leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "It sounds like there's a lot of pain here, but also a desire to understand what went wrong. That's a good place to start. Let's talk about some of those underlying issues." The session was brutal. Jessica admitted that she'd felt neglected for years, like I was more invested in being a dad than a husband. "It's like I disappeared, like I was just part of the furniture," she said, her voice trembling. I shot back that she'd never told me how she felt, that I couldn't fix a problem I didn't know existed. "You can't blame me for not reading your mind, Jess," I said. Dr. Lacey intervened gently, pointing out that we were both stuck in a cycle of unmet needs and unspoken resentment. Jessica felt invisible, and Luke felt blindsided. It's clear there was a breakdown in communication long before the incident. The incident. That was how she referred to Jessica's world record stunt. It felt like such a mild word for something that had turned our lives upside down, but I appreciated her neutrality. By the end of the hour, we were both emotionally drained. Jessica had cried more than once, and I'd come dangerously close myself. But there was also a strange sense of relief. For the first time, we were confronting the things we buried for years. On the drive home, Jessica broke the silence. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "For what?" I asked, glancing at her. "For agreeing to do this," she said. "I know it's not easy for you. It's not easy for me either, but I think it's the right thing." I nodded, staring out the window. "It's a start." We pulled into the driveway, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Finally, Jessica turned to me, her expression earnest. "I know I've said it 100 times, but I'm sorry, Luke. For everything." I looked at her, searching her face for any sign of insincerity, but all I saw was raw honesty. "I know," I said quietly. The next few weeks were a roller coaster. Jessica and I continued counseling, peeling back layers of resentment and hurt that had built up over the years. Some sessions were productive, others felt like we were running in circles. But through it all, we kept showing up. The kids returned home after a month at Jessica's sister's house. Megan was still distant, but she softened slightly when Jessica sat her down and apologized directly. "I made a mistake," Jessica told her. "And I know it's going to take time to earn back your trust, but I promise I'm going to do everything I can to be a better mom." It wasn't a perfect moment. Megan didn't immediately forgive her, but it was a step in the right direction. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Jessica and I sat on the couch, flipping through old photo albums together. "Remember this?" she asked, pointing to a picture of us at a county fair, cotton candy in hand. I smiled faintly. "Yeah, you made me go on that Ferris, well, even though I'm terrified of heights." "You screamed like a baby," she teased, a glimmer of her old self shining through. For the first time in what felt like forever, we laughed together. It was small, fleeting, but it was something. Rebuilding wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be fast. But as we sat there, sharing memories and tentative smiles, I realized that maybe, just maybe, there was still something worth fighting for. And for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope that we could get through this together. Despite the tiny glimmers of hope, rebuilding felt like trying to climb a mountain barefoot. Jessica and I were making progress in therapy, sure, but every step forward came with its share of setbacks. Trust was the elephant in the room. Huge, unavoidable, and impossible to ignore. One afternoon, a few weeks after the kids had returned home, I found myself in a familiar spiral. Jessica's phone had buzzed on the kitchen counter while she was upstairs, and without thinking, I glanced at the screen. It was just a notification from a shopping app, but the knot in my stomach tightened anyway. "Luke, stop it," I muttered to myself, turning away. But the paranoia wouldn't go away. Every time her phone buzzed, every time she left the house, I wondered, was she really trying to change? Or was I being played for a fool? Later that night, as we lay in bed, I finally brought it up. "I'm struggling, Jess," I said quietly. She turned to me, her face shadowed in the dim light. "With what?" "Trusting you," I admitted. "Every time your phone buzzes, every time you go somewhere without me, I can't help but wonder. And I hate feeling like this, but I don't know how to stop." Jessica's expression crumpled. "I get it," she said softly. "You do. And I don't blame you for feeling that way. I'd probably feel the same if the roles were reversed." I nodded, appreciating her honesty, but still feeling the weight of the situation. "What do we do about it?" I asked. Jessica was quiet for a long moment before saying, "I'll do whatever it takes to rebuild that trust. If you want access to my phone, my email, anything, just say the word. I don't want there to be any secrets between us." I hesitated. The idea of monitoring her every move didn't sit right with me. It felt invasive and honestly exhausting. But at the same time, her willingness to be transparent felt like a step in the right direction. "I don't want to be your warden, Jess," I said finally. "But I need to feel like I'm not in the dark anymore. No more surprises. No more secrets." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "Okay, no more secrets." True to her word, Jessica made a point of being open about everything. She'd show me her phone without hesitation, let me know where she was going, and even invite me to join her on errands or outings. It felt strange at first, like a dance we didn't know the steps to, but it helped. Gradually, the tension in our home started to ease. The kids noticed it too. Megan started talking to Jessica again, and the boys seemed happier, more relaxed. But there were still rough patches. One of the hardest moments came during a family outing. We'd taken the kids to the park for a picnic, hoping to enjoy some much-needed normalcy. But as we were setting up, I noticed a group of teenagers nearby, whispering and glancing our way. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but then one of them held up a phone, snapping a picture of Jessica. My blood ran cold. "Seriously?" I muttered under my breath. Jessica noticed too, her face paling. She turned to me, panic in her eyes. "What do we do?" "Just ignore them," I said, though my jaw was clenched. But ignoring them was easier said than done. They didn't approach us, but their snickers and whispers were impossible to miss. The kids noticed too, Megan especially. "Why are they staring?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Jessica looked like she wanted to disappear. I stepped in quickly, trying to defuse the situation. "They're probably just bored," I said casually. "Let's focus on the picnic, okay?" Megan didn't look convinced, but she let it go. Jessica stayed quiet for the rest of the outing, her shoulders tense and her eyes downcast. Later, as we packed up to leave, she turned to me and whispered, "I hate this. I hate that the kids have to deal with this because of me." I didn't know what to say. She wasn't wrong, but pointing that out wouldn't help. That night, after the kids were in bed, Jessica broke down. "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice shaking as tears streamed down her face. I'm trying so hard, Luke. I'm trying to fix everything, but no matter what I do, it feels like the world won't let me move on. I sat down beside her, unsure how to respond. Part of me wanted to comfort her, but another part of me was still angry, still grappling with my own feelings of betrayal. You don't have to fix everything all at once, I said finally. This is going to take time, Jess. A lot of time, and yeah, people are going to talk and it's going to suck. But you can't let that stop you from doing the work. She nodded, wiping her eyes. I just want to be a good mom again, a good wife. I want to be someone you can be proud of. I didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to look at her the same way again. But I knew one thing for sure. We couldn't give up. Not yet. The weeks that followed were a mix of small victories and setbacks. Jessica continued therapy on her own, and I started going to individual sessions as well. Talking to someone who wasn't directly involved helped me unpack my own feelings of anger, hurt, and confusion. We still had a long way to go, but for the first time, I felt like we were starting to rebuild. Not just our marriage, but ourselves. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. The slow climb toward normalcy was like walking through thick fog. Progress was hard to measure, and the destination was always unclear. But for the first time in months, Jessica and I were beginning to feel like we were on the same side. The trust wasn't fully restored. It wasn't even close. But the transparency helped. Jessica didn't just open her phone to me. She opened her life. She kept me in the loop about everything, whether it was small details like running errands or deeper struggles she was working through in therapy. And as much as I hated to admit it, it made a difference. Still, the outside world wasn't as forgiving. The internet hadn't forgotten Jessica's stunt, and every so often, we'd hear whispers or catch judgmental stares in public. It wasn't as bad as the initial firestorm, but it was enough to keep the tension simmering beneath the surface. One afternoon, Jessica suggested something I hadn't expected. Maybe we should go out, she said tentatively, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. I raised an eyebrow. Go out? Like on a date? She nodded, biting her lip. I think it could be good for us to just be together. Away from the kids, the house, all of this. I hesitated, unsure how I felt about the idea. On one hand, part of me missed the simplicity of spending time with her, without the weight of everything hanging over us. On the other hand, the thought of being out in public, where people might recognize her, or worse, judge us, made my stomach turn. You really think it's a good idea? I asked cautiously. Jessica shrugged, her expression hopeful, but uncertain. I don't know, but I think it's worth a try. The following weekend, we went out. Jessica picked a small Italian restaurant on the outskirts of town, hoping it would be quiet enough to avoid any unwanted attention. When we walked in, I was hyper-aware of every glance, every hushed conversation around us. Was it paranoia? Maybe. But after everything we'd been through, it was hard not to assume the worst. Jessica seemed to sense my unease. Do you want to leave? She asked softly as we waited for our food. No, I said quickly, forcing a smile. I'll fine. But I wasn't fine. Not really. The evening wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't exactly magical either. We talked mostly about safe topics, work, the kids, memories from before everything fell apart. There were moments where the conversation flowed naturally, moments where I almost forgot about the weight hanging between us. Almost. On the drive home, Jessica broke the silence. I know that wasn't perfect, she said quietly, but I'm glad we did it. I glanced at her, noticing the way she was fidgeting with her hands in her lap. Yeah, I said after a pause. Me too. She smiled faintly, and for a brief moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. The next day, Megan asked about the date. How was it? She asked, her tone cautious but curious. It was fine, I said, keeping my answer short. Megan didn't press, but I could tell she was gauging my reaction. She'd become surprisingly perceptive since all of this started. Maybe out of necessity, given how much her world had been upended. Are you guys going to stay together? She asked after a long pause. The question caught me off guard. I don't know, I admitted. We're trying, but it's complicated. She nodded, her expression unreadable. I hope you do, she said softly. Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. Jessica and I continued to take small steps forward. We went on more outings, gradually getting more comfortable in public. Some nights, we stayed up late talking, sharing things we hadn't told each other in years. Other nights, the silence between us felt heavier than ever. One evening, as we sat on the back porch watching the kids play in the yard, Jessica turned to me and said something I didn't expect. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of what?" I asked, glancing at her. "Of losing this," she said, gesturing toward the kids, the house, the life we'd built. "Of losing you. I know I've already put everything on the line, and I can't blame you if you decide you're done. But I'm scared, Luke. I don't want to lose us." Her voice cracked, and for the first time in a long time, I saw the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the kind that reminded me of the woman I married. "I don't want to lose us either," I said quietly. And in that moment, I realized it wasn't just about forgiving Jessica or rebuilding trust. It was about figuring out if we could find our way back to each other, if the love we once shared could survive the storm we'd been through. It wasn't a perfect moment. It wasn't a promise that everything would be okay. But it was a start, and for now, that was enough. Time moved forward, dragging us with it, and slowly, painfully, we began to settle into something resembling a routine. Life wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close. But Jessica and I were both trying in our own ways. The kids noticed the difference. Megan, always the most perceptive, had started to warm up to Jessica again, though her trust was still guarded. The boys, in their endless energy and innocence, seemed to have adjusted more quickly, as if their young minds couldn't fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened. As for Jessica and me, we were in uncharted territory, navigating a fragile truce that felt as delicate as a house of cards. One Saturday, Jessica suggested a family day out. "It doesn't have to be anything big," she said. "Just something for the kids. I think we all need it." I hesitated. The idea of going out as a family, exposing ourselves to public scrutiny, made my stomach tighten. But the kids deserved some normalcy, and deep down, I knew Jessica was right. "Okay," I said. "Where?" She lit up slightly, clearly relieved. "There's a fall festival at the park. It's small, low-key. It could be fun." I agreed, though I wasn't entirely convinced. The festival was crowded, but not overwhelming. There were pumpkin patches, hayrides, face painting, and food trucks lining the park's perimeter. The boys took off immediately, racing toward the bounce house while Megan hung back, scrolling on her phone. Jessica and I trailed behind, watching the kids from a distance. "This feels nice," she said cautiously, as if she didn't want to jinx it. "Yeah," I agreed, though I was still on edge, scanning the crowd for anyone who might recognize us. At one point, Megan approached Jessica with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Mom," she said, holding up her phone, "somebody from school just sent me this." Jessica's face drained of color as she took the phone, her hands trembling. It was a meme, another cruel joke at her expense. "I'm sorry," Megan said quickly. "I didn't want to ruin the day, but I thought you should know." Jessica stared at the screen, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly, handing the phone back. I watched her closely, waiting for her to crumble, but instead, she took a deep breath and turned to Megan. "Listen," Jessica said, her voice steady. "I know people are going to say things. I can't change that, but I can control how I handle it. And I don't want you to ever feel like you have to carry that weight for me. Okay? If you hear something, if someone says something, you come to me or your dad. Don't let it sit on your shoulders." Megan blinked, clearly taken aback. "Okay," she said after a pause. I gave Jessica a small nod, impressed by her composure. It was one of the first times I'd seen her handle a tough situation with the kids so gracefully. That night, after the kids were asleep, Jessica and I sat on the couch, decompressing. "You handled that well today," I said, breaking the comfortable silence. She glanced at me, surprised. "Thanks. I was terrified. Honestly." "You didn't show it," I said. Megan needed that. Jessica smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes. "I just want to do right by them. By all of you. I know it's going to take time, but I'm not giving up." I nodded, my chest tightening. "I know." For the first time, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't expected: pride. Jessica was owning her mistakes, facing them head on, and trying to rebuild, not just for me, but for herself and the kids. It didn't erase the pain or the betrayal, but it was something. The following week, we had another counseling session. "I want to talk about forgiveness," Dr. Lacey said, looking between us. Jessica tensed, and I felt my jaw tighten. It was a loaded word, one that neither of us had brought up until now. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting," Dr. Lacey continued. "And it doesn't mean condoning what happened. It's about releasing yourself from the weight of anger and resentment. So let's start with this. Luke, do you think you could ever forgive Jessica?" I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, my thoughts a tangled mess. "I don't know," I said finally. "I want to, for the kids, for myself, for us. But it's hard. Every time I think I'm ready to move on, something pulls me back. Something reminds me of what she did." Jessica nodded, her face somber. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight," she said. "Or ever, honestly. But I hope we can keep working towards something, whatever that looks like." Dr. Lacey smiled gently. "That's a good place to start. Forgiveness isn't a destination, it's a process. And the fact that you're both willing to work toward it is a step in the right direction." That night, as we lay in bed, Jessica reached for my hand, a small, tentative gesture. I hesitated for a moment before taking it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a promise of forever. But it was a sign that, despite everything, we were still in this together. For now, that was enough.